it's just that I'm not in Texas anymore. But it is especially wonderful to be here because I was born and raised in North Dakota. I cycled through the Twin Cities a couple of times, as Chuck mentioned, most recently to do graduate work at the University of Minnesota. And it was at the University of Minnesota in that period that I started becoming aware of these issues, and my life really changed considerably. I thought what I should do to start, and this takes me back to that period, is to make it clear that I'll be speaking tonight from a feminist perspective, and from a branch of the feminist movement that's usually called radical feminist. Now, when I was 29 years old and I wandered to Minneapolis and started doing graduate work, I knew a lot about feminism. I knew that feminists were ugly women who couldn't get dates. That was what I knew about feminism, literally. I had a very typical conception of feminism for men in the culture, which is to say I knew nothing about who feminists were, what they believed, and what they worked for. And I was lucky enough at the University of Minnesota to bump into some really wonderful women and a few really great men who were doing feminist work within the university and in the community as well, and it really did change my life for the better from my point of view. And to honor that, I want to actually read a paragraph from one of the first feminist essays I read, which really put me on this path. It's an essay by Andrea Dworkin that some of you may know. It's called I Want a 24-Hour Truce During Which There Is No Rape. It's a speech she gave in 1983 to a men's group actually in Minnesota. And this is what she told those men in that 1983 talk. She said, "I don't believe rape is inevitable or natural. If I did, I would have no reason to be here. If I did, my political practice would be very different than it is. Have you ever wondered why we women are not just in armed combat against you? It's not because there's a shortage of kitchen knives in this country. It's because we believe in your humanity against all the evidence." And when I read that in the full essay, I had to start rethinking my understanding of feminism and recognizing that, in fact, feminists didn't hate men. In fact, feminists, in a sense, love men more than we often love ourselves. And that feminism was not a threat to me as a man, which is the way I'd always been presented with feminism and the way I'd come to understand it. That, in fact, feminism is a gift to us. It is a way we can deepen our own humanity, in fact, sometimes even claim our own humanity for the first time. So I'll be speaking from that feminist point of view, and again, from a fairly radical feminist point of view. I don't take radical to be a pejorative either. I think when we look at the problems we face, not only around gender and violence, but across the board, it is in fact radical analyses and radical action that is most compelling and most called for. So that's just a little truth in advertising to start us out here. What I want to talk tonight about, and perhaps it's maybe good that Tony got held up, because I want to try and be provocative about some fundamental questions that might help spark some thought as we go into tomorrow's workshops and other presentations. I think the way to start this would be to go to the subtitle of this book I wrote on pornography, Getting Off Pornography and the End of Masculinity. It's a subtitle that people aren't always clear about and aren't sure how to interpret. I occasionally have men who look worried who say, "Are you suggesting that they should get rid of all of us?" And no, of course, we're not talking about the elimination of men. That would be, of course, biologically impossible. If there were to be such action, there would have to be some small percentage of men kept as breeding stock. So some of us will be just not toiling for the elimination of all men, for goodness sakes, that doesn't make any sense. I proposed, just as a joke, when people say, what's the answer to men's violence and everything, I say, well, just kill all the men, except for some small percentage of men you keep for reproduction. And there's always a few women in the audience who smile and say, I'm down with that, no problem. As long as we get to choose the ones that we keep for the breeding stock, that's fine with us. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the concept of masculinity, not those of us who are biologically male, not the end of us, but rethinking this whole concept. So what I want to do is actually talk about that fundamental concept of masculinity. And I want to do that, we'll have a little audience participation up front. One way I think to get into this is to imagine yourself, if you're a parent, you can imagine doing this, a parent of a boy child, you may have already done it. Otherwise, let's just imagine if you had a boy who was starting to come of age, maybe 10, 11 years old, whatever, and that boy came to you, your boy child, or if you're not a parent, your nephew or some kid in the neighborhood, and this 10, 11-year-old boy said, "What does it mean to be a man?" and asked you that question. What would you say to a growing boy who was trying to understand what it meant to be a man? So let's, we're already in conversational mode here tonight. Chuck and Frank started it all. So what do you think? What would you say? Just throw out phrases, words, anything. What does it mean to be a man? I'll keep a list. Yeah.
Affectionate.
Affectionate, okay.
Responsible.
Responsible.
Respectful.
Respectful.
Independent.
Independent.
Supportive.
Supportive.
Protect women.
Pardon?
Protect women.
Protect. Okay. Anything else?
Sensitive to the needs of others.
Sensitive. Okay.
Helpful.
Helpful.
Role model.
Role model.
I might change the question to what does it mean to be human?
Wait, don't get ahead of it here.
Provide.
Okay, provider. That's okay. So I think it doesn't take long to get to the list. Okay. So we understand. We could call these kind of the idealized conceptions of masculinity. If someone we cared about who was grappling with what it means to be a man in the culture, we would have these kinds of answers. And they would be good answers, and I think we would all probably endorse them. They all have a positive connotation. All right. Put that aside. We'll come back to those in a minute. Now I want to ask a different question. Coming again at this same idea, what does it mean to be a man? Let's think about how the dominant culture answers that question in practice. And I think the easiest way to do this is to think about spaces in the world that are either exclusively male or overwhelmingly male-defined and populated mostly by men. So what are the places in our lives, in the contemporary United States, we'll stick to this country, what are the spaces that are either exclusively male or predominantly male and tend to be male-defined? I'm talking about institutions, activities, physical spaces. What comes to mind if I were to ask that?
Religious institutions.
Military.
Okay, I heard the military. Now it's not exclusively male anymore, but it's overwhelmingly male and male-defined. What else?
Many religious institutions.
Okay, well, religious institutions, though, the membership, I think, if we might talk about hierarchies.
Football stadiums.
Okay, sports is another one. Obviously, athletics, there are now women's athletics, despite the complaints of people like my father, who are still not sure that the concept of women's athletics is coherent. He still doesn't think girls really do sports. But still sport, especially sports like football and hockey and boxing that are definitively male.
Gentlemen's clubs.
Okay, we're going to get to that too. Questions about sexuality.
U.S. senators.
Politics, especially at the upper levels.
County commissioners.
Okay, so the realm of politics. So we have the military, we have sports, we have politics, we have corporations, the business world, especially. Okay, all right. So essentially, we're defining the whole world. But let's look at those places where there really is a kind of dominance of men. And I think, for purposes of discussion, out of all of those, let's just take a few. Let's take sports, the military, and business. All right. Now, not in this idealized sense that we just answered the question, but in reality, in the world that boys and men live in, how is that question, what does it mean to be a man, actually answered in practice? What words, what phrases come to mind when you think about how men, boys are socialized in the culture within those institutions that tend to define masculinity? And we can think, for those of us who are male, we can think about our own training. So what kind of words come to mind that define being a man in those spaces? Entitlement, strong,
Assertive.
assertive, competitive,
Successful.
authoritarian,
Don't feel.
don't feel, unemotional,
Anti-woman.
anti-woman,
Pompous.
pompous,
Dominant.
dominant. Okay, tough. I think, again, the words that come up, they cluster pretty quickly around ideas of dominance and control, competitiveness and aggression, and in all of those, either a literal or a metaphoric kind of violence. I mean, obviously in the military, the violence is right there. That is, in fact, the purpose of the military. Sports, there are a number of sports that are extremely violent, and by that I mean the violence is not accidental, it's the nature of the sport. Obviously a sport like boxing is nothing but violence in a sense. Football and hockey are sports with sort of violence woven into them. And in business, there's a kind of, I would suggest, a kind of metaphorical violence. You destroy the competition, you bury your competitors, you kill them. That's the language of business. So when we look at how masculinity is actually defined in practice, in those institutions that socialize men most clearly, we come around terms like dominance, control, conquest, aggression, and violence. Well, what does this tell us about the notion of power that we get in masculinity? Well, I think in terms that are sometimes used in political science and other realms, we're talking about the concept of power as power over. Power in this sense is defined as the ability to make someone do what they would otherwise not do. That's the crassest definition of power in this idea of power over. You are powerful when you can compel someone to do what they would otherwise not do, if not for your presence, your coercion, your force, your authority, legal, moral, or otherwise. So I think when we actually look at masculinity in the world, we see that masculinity clusters around these ideas about dominance, and they connect to a conception of power that is, I think, best summarized as power over. That is to say, it's power that operates in hierarchy. Right? Hierarchies where there is a class distinction around different axes of people with more or less power. All right. So masculinity in reality is defined that way, and I think it would not be difficult to get a rough consensus in this room that that conception of power, that conception of masculinity is in fact toxic. That is, it is dangerous. It is dangerous for many people. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so now we're dealing, moving from the idealized articulation that we might have of masculinity to the reality of masculinity as it plays out in the world in which we were raised and we live today. So I think the place you can see this most clearly and most painfully is around sexuality and intimacy. Let's just start with the language of sexuality. I was being educated up at St. Cloud State by younger people about some of the phrases that are used around sexuality. And one that was really new to me, and I realize it's been around a while and I'm just getting old and kind of out of it, but when men see a woman, these are all in heterosexual situations obviously, if a man sees a woman he would find sexually attractive, one phrase that is apparently used is, "I'd hit it." I'd hit it. Is that, for the young, I see the young, this is true, yes. That phrase wasn't around when I was a high school and college student, but apparently that is a popular phrase. Just as a sort of digression, apparently McDonald's, the fast food company, did an ad a couple of years ago with people looking at a Big Mac or something and saying, "I'd hit it," not recognizing what they were trying to be hip. A reminder for those of us who are getting old, attempts to be hip, they fall very flat. My 17-year-old son reminds me of this regularly with that look of, it's a combination of embarrassment and disgust. Like, don't do this to me, and are you really this stupid? I'm learning how to decode that book. But if you think about it, I mean, it's not just young men today. This is a language that's been with us. If I think back to high school, I graduated from high school in 1976. If you were with the guys, and let's say you've been on a date over the weekend, so Bob has gone out with Sally. Bob comes back to school on Monday. What did your male friends say? Did they say, "Hey, Bob, I hear you went out with Sally. Did you have a meaningful emotional interaction, and do you feel you know Sally better today than you did over last week?" No, I don't ever remember any high school boy, any college man, anybody when I was a young adult saying to me in that situation, "Did your interaction with this woman result in an emotional connection? Did you learn anything about yourself, about her?" I don't remember that. Maybe I just ran with the wrong gang, but the words and the discussion was what? It was, I think it's really summed up in the one phrase, "Did you get any? Did you get any?" Okay. So what do we learn from phrases like "I'd hit it" or "Did you get any"? We realize then that sexuality in this society, with this conception of masculinity, is constructed as the acquisition of pleasure from a woman. It is something you get from, and the woman in this context is almost always rendered more as an object than as a subject, more as someone you take from than someone you interact with. And we know that that means by which we get it is on a continuum. There's a range of strategies that boys and men use to get it. We know that at the far end is overt violence in sexual assault, that which we legally define as rape. And it's very easy to mark that which we legally define as rape and try to cordon off the men who do that and say, the bad guys, there they are. We can see them because they violate the state statute on sexual assault. But of course, if we're honest with ourselves, we know there's a range of behaviors. And I'm not suggesting that all of those behaviors are morally equivalent. I am suggesting, however, that those behaviors are rooted in the same conception of men, women, sex, gender, and power. That it is the acquisition of pleasure from a woman. And we know when we move from on that continuum from those things we call rape or sexual assault by law, that the ease with which we mark off the good guys and the bad guys becomes much more difficult to sustain. I work on a college campus with a vibrant Greek system, a place where you can see painfully, obviously, how this plays out. But even then, if we don't just look at those bad guys in the fraternity and start moving on the continuum, I think the point makes itself that underlying construction of sex as the acquisition of pleasure from a woman, again, speaking only in heterosexual contexts here, that's rooted in that conception of masculinity. That conception of masculinity that defines manhood as power over, as dominance, conquest, control, aggression, violence. Now, the consequences of this are quite clear. The consequences for men are that we are often, for lack of a better phrase, emotionally deformed. Our own inability to experience our own inner life, to make connections with other men and with women, is not hard to chart. If you're a therapist working with men, I suspect there are some, this ain't news to you. If you're a man, it's not news to you. If you're a woman, okay, so it's not news to anybody because everybody has either the direct experience or the reality of being in relationship, some kind of relationship with someone who's in that position. And here, I don't speak from on high. I'm talking as much about myself as anyone else in the room. The struggle to try and become fully human when that conception of who you are has been imposed on you since you were a child. And in my case, it's actually, I think the story is even more compelling because I grew up well outside the conventional definition of masculinity. I'm of normal height now, but as a child, I was extremely small. I was always the shortest kid in the class. I was always the thinnest kid in the class. I still remember my father bringing home endless cans. This is before organic food, health food was so normal. Bringing home somebody's lab endless cans of these powders that you were supposed to mix to gain weight. This was how my father expressed his great concern for me. Talk about emotionally deformed. We won't go down that road too much, or we'll be here all night. But, right. So I was a person. I was the classic small, presumptively gay. I was, and even someone in that position, who as a child experienced what it was like to be on the bottom of that kind of gender hierarchy within masculinity. By the time I was in my 20s, I had learned how to be a man in the toxic conception that we're talking about. So I always want to make it clear, I'm not lifting myself out of this. This is as much my own story as anybody else's. Well, the one place where I've looked at this most intensely is in the subject of pornography. And I want to say a bit about just that study, because it's been an interesting 20 years that I have spent looking at the pornography industry, the images it produces, and the way that those are used by men and used against women in the world. And there's, in a way, an intensity to pornography that I had not really experienced anywhere else. I always remember I was doing a training at a rape crisis center in Houston, and it was the first time I'd ever done a presentation to frontline workers in a sexual assault center. And I always looked at the women who did that work, these are almost all women, as really they're my heroes. You know, the women who are out on the front lines doing the counseling, doing the education, doing the intervention. I never could understand how they managed. It seemed to me, you know, sort of emotionally and physically overwhelming. And so I always held up those women, and I still do to some degree, as sort of the ultimate, you know, people in the struggle against sexual violence. And as we were going through this program on pornography, which included no images, I wasn't showing pictures at this point, we were just talking about the content of pornography, I could see these women really in pain. And finally, at the end, one of them, when I asked for some feedback, and this was a woman who had been working on frontline sexual assault work for more than a decade, she said, it just hurts. You know, and I said, well, you know, in your experience as a sexual assault counselor, you've heard every story, every brutality, every degradation. You know, how in the world could this affect you like this? And we talked about it, and it was interesting. And there is something about pornography that takes this even deeper. And I think the reason is in part because we live in an increasingly pornographic culture that you can never turn away from. In the question of sexual assault, you can always turn somewhere for relief. There's always a space there is a process by which individual people heal, by which, you know, groups of women come together. But with pornography, it's this constant reminder of who you are in the world if you are a woman. And there's something incredibly intense and very disturbing about pornography. And I think that's one of the reasons why the subject is so difficult to deal with, not only in the dominant culture, but even in feminist spaces. It is very difficult to deal with. It actually creates a lot of controversy within feminist spaces. Sometimes even within sexual assault and DV centers, I've experienced people not wanting to deal with pornography. So if everybody is sort of shying away from it, it seems to me, let's go to it. That we learn something by that which strikes those deep fears in us. And what we learn from contemporary pornography is how deeply woven into the fabric of masculinity this conception of men as needing to be dominant, controlling, aggressive, and violent, how deeply woven in that is to our sexuality in contemporary culture. And in programs I do about pornography, I describe in some detail trends in the content of pornography. It's not just that pornography has provided this image of men as sexually dominant, sexually aggressive, sexually violent. It's that the trend in the contemporary pornography industry is to an increasing intensification of that dominance, conquest, control, and violence. That is, pornography, in the same period that women have made gains in education, made gains in the business world, made gains in politics, obviously not to the point where folks in this room are satisfied, but gains all the same, that in that same period of time, the content of commercially produced, mass-marketed heterosexual pornography is more overtly cruel and degrading toward women, and also more overtly racist. And there's something to wrestle with that. In a civilized society, how is it that as a mass media genre like pornography becomes more and more acceptable, more and more dominant in the culture, and pornography in that same period has become more and more mainstream than ever. At the same time that it's become more mainstream, it's become more and more overtly cruel and degrading to women, more and more overtly racist, as women have made some gains in other arenas. I think what it does is it pulls us back to recognizing that the conception of masculinity really hasn't changed all that much. Now, I'm not going to go into a full discussion of pornography as I do in talks that are dedicated just to that. And we are going to screen the film tomorrow afternoon, The Price of Pleasure, a film I was a consultant on that does, I think, lay out the case very quickly. But for those who are not consumers of pornography or students of it, let me make it clear just what this looks like. The segment of the pornographic film market where one sees this most clearly is the segment called gonzo pornography. Gonzo pornography is the style of pornography that is very cheap, easy to make, no pretense of plot, dialogue. It's probably the fastest growing and may well be the most profitable part of the pornography industry at this point. And it's where the pornography industry pushes the envelope. Right? Like any other media genre, the pornography industry is always trying to expand audience, expand market share, expand profits. And to do that, you can't stand still. You have to constantly find new ways to engage the audience. So where does the pornography market go when it wants to expand market share and profit? Does it go to deeper storylines with more intimacy, trying to represent the complexity of human relationships, especially between men and women? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. It goes where it believes the male sexual imagination wants to go, because the dominant portion of the market is male. The consumer base of pornography is overwhelmingly male. If you ask people in the industry, for all their talk about the couples market and how much women love pornography now that you've been liberated, in case you didn't know this, women, you've been liberated and you can enjoy pornography now. They all know that the overwhelming majority of pornography consumers are men. When I ask producers and directors what percentage of your audience is male, they say 80, 90%, right? Without question. So they are making pornographic films, graphic, sexually explicit material, for a primarily male audience. And where do they believe they can expand market share and profit? In the gonzo productions, it's by increasing the overt degradation and cruelty toward women with new practices that not only is going to push the limits of people's sexual behavior, but in fact create new sexual practices. So very quickly, and this will be the only explicit part of the talk tonight, one of the places that there's been a growth market in pornography is a genre called DPs. DP is industry slang for double penetration. A double penetration is a film in which a woman is penetrated anally and vaginally by two men at the same time. That is one form of what is called multiple penetration. Another scene in pornography that's become more commonplace and more popular is called a double anal. A double anal is a scene in which a woman is penetrated anally by two men at the same time. Another is a double vag. You get the picture. It's a scene in which a woman is penetrated vaginally by two men at the same time. Another technique in gonzo pornography that's become more and more popular is called gagging. It is, these are films that are focused on oral sex, women performing oral sex on men, with the men pushing their penises so far down the woman's throat that she gags, and that's the goal, is to make her gag, hence the name Gag Factor and other similar films. The fifth practice, which is really recent, I think makes this point, and I apologize for the language, but this is in fact the reality. There is a type of scene in pornography today. It's not in every film, but it's more and more commonplace, and when these scenes do appear, they're advertised. This is part of the marketing appeal. These are scenes called ATM scenes, and no, they do not have anything to do with automatic teller machines. An ATM scene is, ATM is industry acronym for ass to mouth. And an ass to mouth scene is a scene in which a man penetrates a woman anally removes his penis and without hygiene places his penis into the mouth of that woman or another woman. Now, what can we learn about not only pornography, but the world we live in from looking at this? Again, I want to make it clear, the scenes I just described, they're not in every pornographic film. Double penetrations are now relatively routine. ATM's a little less so, but all of the practices I just described to you can be easily found by walking into any pornographic book and film store, although there are fewer of those these days, and can be found easily on the internet in any website that sells pornographic DVDs or other types of internet sites. So I'm not describing something that you have to buy out of the trunk of a car in a dark alley somewhere off in the bad part of town. Right? We're talking about stuff that is square in the mainstream of the culture. I'm not suggesting everybody endorses it. It's not mainstream in that sense. But it certainly is readily available. And despite laws that could be used, perhaps prosecuted, those laws are, for the most part, unenforced. So we're talking about something that's part of the dominant culture. And what do we learn from it? Well, we learn a lot about the male sexual imagination. We learn a lot about conceptions of masculinity. After all, what is really being sold in such a pornographic film? It's a conception of sexuality that Andrea Dworkin identified most clearly in her work starting in the 1970s, well into the 80s, that is not just sex on film. It is sex presented in the context of domination and subordination, that primary dynamic being male domination and female subordination. Although pornography does not just eroticize or sexualize men's domination over women, it eroticizes racism, it eroticizes every power dynamic that you can imagine. Think of any power dynamic that you know where there is a hierarchy. Somebody with power, somebody without power. And I can guarantee you there is a pornographic film that eroticizes that dynamic. And I would bet my retirement fund on that. And I bet my retirement fund from 5 years ago on that even. And it was actually worth something. So we see that when we look at pornography, we don't just see sex on film, we see sex as it is constructed in patriarchy. That's one of those feminist terms. We're not supposed to talk about patriarchy. Ruled by fathers, men's domination over women, woven into the fabric of every institution in the society, and in fact playing out in visceral form in pornography. That's why I say that pornography is a kind of mirror. If we have the courage to look at it, it's a mirror of the culture, of what really constructs masculinity in this culture. Now, I said that the consequences of this for men are that we tend to struggle with these problems in our emotional lives. So let's remind ourselves, however difficult that is, and I don't want to minimize the difficulties men have in coming to be, fully functioning emotional beings. But whatever that struggle is, it is nothing like the struggle of being a woman in the culture. That however it is, as a feminist said, and I'm going to do this from memory so I don't have the quote exactly right, but she said, when presented with this idea that men suffer in contemporary patriarchy as much as women, she said, well, think about it. Men are afraid to cry. Women are afraid of being killed. That kind of neatly summarizes the different consequences for being male and female in patriarchy. So if men struggle with those emotional questions, if men struggle with hierarchies among men, if there's elevated rates of violence among men as a result of this, I think we can agree it's nothing like what women deal with on an everyday basis. A world in which, depending on how you read statistics, I think the unquestionable number is that something like 16, 17, 18% of women, 1 out of 5 women roughly, will be the victim of a legally defined rape in their lifetime. If you expand our focus, as I suggested earlier, from only those acts that meet the legal definition of sexual assault to all of the kinds of unwanted sexual attention that women get in the culture. This is a category I just call sexual intrusion. So on the one hand, you have violent sexual assault, and you move on that continuum to what I call sort of sexualized violence, or violence by sex, aggression through sex, unwanted sex, sex in which women feel that they've consented, but it was consent under conditions that were coercive in some ways, sex done with alcohol, all of those onto sexual harassment, whether it's in the classroom, in the workplace, obscene phone calls, cat calls on the street, the kinds of attention that not only might be annoying and obnoxious, but might make one feel physically at risk. Take all of those acts and call that category sexual intrusion. I've done a detailed study of this, groundbreaking new work actually, I'm about to publish. You heard it here first. The percentage of women in the contemporary United States, you want to write this down, that's right. The percentage of women in the contemporary United States who have experienced sexual intrusion in their lifetime is 100%. I mean, it's a joke. You don't need a study to understand. All you have to do is look out in the audience and look at the women nodding their heads. Yes, okay. Right. So we're talking about a conception of masculinity that not only has consequences for men, but of course has consequences for women and of course for children as well. So let me go back, and here's where I'm going to conclude, and we can open it up for as much discussion as you like. I want to go back to the first list that we made about what it means to be a man. The second list, the list that came out of the dominant culture, I think we would agree is problematic. At least we could say that. I use the word toxic, others might use other words, but I think we can agree that a world in which masculinity is shaped by those markers we noted in the culture, dominance, control, aggression, conquest, violence, that produces a world that is profoundly unsafe. I would argue a world that is inevitably unjust and unsustainable as well. But let's go back to that first list of qualities of a man that we were labeling the idealized list, the list that we would tell our boy children in trying to shape and socialize them in a healthy way. Let me go back to them. They included affection, responsibility, respect, independence, being supportive, protecting women, being sensitive, helpful. Can't read my own writing there. Something important that I didn't write very clearly, and being a provider. All right, now there was already someone who kind of gave away the punchline here. So let's just reflect on those, though. Is there anyone in the room who would like to argue that men are compared with women, capable of affection, respect, responsibility, all those things, in some definitive way that women are not? Is there any guy in the room who would like to stand up and say, no, men have a particular capacity for affection, responsibility, respect, above and beyond women? Is there anybody who'd like to make that argument? Any guy want to stand up and say, no, well, yes, women, but we're definitively and in some way fundamentally more than? I didn't think so. Looking around at the women in the room, I wouldn't make that argument either. Maybe in the hallway, maybe in the bathroom. Well, you know, I would have said it, but those women would have skinned me alive, you know. Okay, so I think the point I'm trying to make, as the earlier comment indicated, is self-evident. When we articulate a vision of masculinity that we can tell our children they should aspire to, it is not really a vision of masculinity. It's a vision of being a person. It answers the question not what does it mean to be a man, it answers the question what does it mean to be a decent human being? And every one of those traits were not specific to men or women. They were in fact ideals we pursue as a person. Now in saying this, I want to be very clear. I am not suggesting that men and women are the same. Okay? In fact, I think this is it's one of those many interesting questions we probably will never really have an answer to. Men and women have different bodies. I get that. I'm from North Dakota, but I did learn at least, you know, I got the basics, you know. People in Minnesota like to look down on the Dakotas. I know. You won't say it, but I know you do. I know the jokes you tell. I heard. So, you know, we have different bodies. We have different reproductive organs. I do not have the capacity to bear children or nurse children. Now, the fact that every woman doesn't bear children or nurse children doesn't mean that biology isn't meaningful. And quite frankly, I would be surprised if there weren't some differences between the biologically male and biologically female of the species that didn't grow out of that difference in our reproductive organs, our bodies. I suspect there are some differences, and by differences I don't just mean differences in muscle mass or average height. I mean differences in intellectual or psychological or moral development. I don't know what those differences are. There might be there. It's not crazy to imagine there could be differences that stem out of those fundamentally different bodies that we have. The question is, do we want to rush to assume that those differences are profound, definitive, and in fact divide us? And this culture does that. This is a culture obsessed with gender. This is a culture in which you can have a best-selling book called Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. You remember that one? I always forget the guy's name because I don't like him and I don't want to remember his name. Somebody remind me, who wrote that book? John Gray, thank you. So men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Men and women are not only different animals, different humans, men are from different planets than women. Right? This idea that there's something so fundamentally different. Well, once you start assuming that there are these fundamental differences that are akin to being from different planets, what you're doing is justifying male dominance. You are justifying patriarchy. Once you start to say, well, this is just the way men are, this is just the way women are, you might decide you want to modify the worst consequences of the system, but you are essentially committing yourself to the system. And again, one doesn't have to live in some science fiction fantasy and say men and, I'm not talking about some, cyborg future where men and women are, I'm not going down that road. I'm saying, yes, we're different. Yes, we have different bodies. Yes, those different bodies may give rise to differences in our psychology, but do we really need to assume that those differences are so profound they produce radically different kinds of human beings? In my experience, that is not the case. Obviously, there's something different between men and women, or patriarchy would not have arisen in the first place. I mean, there are some intellectual sort of assertions that are pretty self-evident in some sense. But in this culture, we rush to assume that those differences are everything. And I think sometimes even those of us who do feminist-inspired anti-violence work fall into that trap. And I think it raises some really tough questions. It raises principled questions that we may not be able to answer, right? Intellectual questions about what is in fact the nature of the difference between men and women psychologically. Personally, I don't have a lot of faith. I've been in the academic realm for 20 years. I've seen a lot of psychology professors tell me how they know they can answer these questions. Every year I'm in the academy, I believe them less and less, to the point where I have sometimes trouble keeping a straight face in front of them. And so I'm cautious about the degree to which we can ever answer the questions. Doesn't mean that research doesn't sometimes help us. But a question like that we may never be able to answer. Why do we assume then that these differences are so profound? I think it's because it is in the interests of patriarchy to assume that. And if anything, I think human history argues otherwise. Because the one thing I always try to remind my students is that we have a very distorted view of the history of the human species. And it's all bound up in the words history and prehistory. The existence of the Homo sapien on the planet is divided into two categories, history and prehistory. History is that which we have some record of, whether it's through recorded language or artifacts. That's most of what we know, most of what we teach as history, is from a very small period of human history. It's really from the period after human beings became farmers, when we left behind a gathering and hunting existence, became farmers, started the rise of what we call, paradoxically, civilization. Human writing goes back about 10 to 12,000 years, human writing goes back about 5,000 years, and we talk about history, and then there's this dumping ground called prehistory. Well, if you look at that time frame, isn't it funny that prehistory is actually 95% of our evolutionary history? And in fact, patriarchy, the rise of so-called civilization with male dominance, is only 5% of our evolutionary history. Yet we generalize from that 5% to say this is what the world is, this is what men are, and what we are doing is generalizing from patriarchy, when in fact patriarchy does not define all of human history. There's just some logical things we got to deal with here, some facts. And I think when we start to deal with them, we realize that this obsession with men, women, masculinity, femininity, this idea that we can read onto the different bodies, different psychologies, different moral development, different intellectual development, different emotional development, I think is, to say the least, highly suspect. And I think the reason we do it is because even when we don't want to, we fall into patriarchal traps. And here's why we have to stop doing it, because the payoff is a different conception of power. When we can get out of this, I think we can move from a conception of power only as power over. That is, power defined as the ability to make people do what they would otherwise not do. We can move from that into what feminists and some others have called power with. The creative sense of human power, the ability of people to come together, not because we're exactly the same, not because we always agree, but in collaboration to create, to magnify the power of each person, not to control others, but to create something new. And the one thing that's clear is that power with is power that has transcended hierarchy. And hierarchy is not inevitable. If there's one thing, you know, the longer you teach, for those of you who've been teaching or been teaching a long time, the longer you teach, the more you realize you're teaching the same thing over and over again, and you really got about 1 or 2 lessons that you just keep repeating in different ways. And I think if there is, you know, a single concept that I'm increasingly trying to teach, it is that hierarchy is not inevitable. We are taught day in and day out in every facet of life that hierarchy is inevitable. We get that lesson most compellingly in the economy, in capitalism. In capitalism, the economic system that defines our lives, we are told hierarchy is inevitable. We are in fact told that without hierarchy, we would starve and die. This is probably the greatest propaganda victory in the history of the human species. For capitalism, a system that has only been with us, depending on how you chart it, let's say 200, 250 years. Capitalism has convinced us that without the hierarchy inherent in capitalism, we would starve and die. That without hierarchy, there'd be no motivation to produce. Without that, we'd all be, you know, scratching out a living in the dirt somewhere. Okay? Think about that for a second. 250 years of human history has convinced us that there's no other way people could live. When students say that to me, they say, well, how else could we live without capitalism and the greed and the motivation to produce? I say, well, I don't know, what did people do before capitalism? There's, you know, a couple 100,000 years of human history before that. Did those people starve and die? Now, to say that isn't to say that previous economic systems were not hierarchical. Feudalism was extremely hierarchical, right? The Roman Empire had a certain amount of hierarchy in it. It's not to validate or valorize other systems. It's to recognize that we're sold a bill of goods, just like every other system, just like feudalism sold people a bill of goods, that hierarchy was inevitable. That's what the nobles said to the serfs and the peasants. Without this, nothing can work. Just like the Romans said. Okay, so every time we go back in history and we look at the claim that hierarchy is inevitable, we know that it was fraudulent, it was a claim made in the service of those with power. So I think if we are going to escape the trap, and here I'm not just talking in gender terms, I mean the trap of the modern human. The modern human that has created a world that is profoundly unjust. If you doubt that, let me give you one statistic. This is from the World Bank, a reliable source. Yes, the World Bank, not some radical, crazy outlet. The World Bank statistics show that half the world's population, that's more than 3 billion people, half the world's population lives on less than $2.50 a day US. More than 3 billion people on this planet, as we speak tonight, are living on less than $2.50 a day. Let me put that in even more stark relief. Half the people in the world today live on less than I will spend for a cup of coffee at the Minneapolis airport tomorrow or Sunday when I leave town. Right. That is a profoundly unjust world. That is a world marked by such inequality that it staggers the imagination. That inequality is present not only worldwide, but internally increasingly in the United States, right, where there is a kind of internal third world developing. That is a profoundly unjust world. But that's not the worst news, because of course the worst news is that we live in a fundamentally unsustainable world, that the high energy, high technology world that we live in, which makes this building possible, is in fact fundamentally unsustainable. And here you don't have to find one statistic, just look across the board. Look at the statistics on topsoil loss, on groundwater contamination, on the size and number of dead zones in the oceans, and of course, rapid climate change. add all of that up, what does that tell you? That tells you we live in an unsustainable system, and I have made another, here's another one for you, write this one down too. This is a theoretical breakthrough I've made. I've been studying, you know, if all of you can't follow me, that's fine. All of you aren't in universities, so you may not be aware of it. So this is what we call high theory. I think we have a little disrespect for the academic world out here.
Takes one to know one.
Yeah. So here's what I've concluded after much theoretical insight. Unsustainable systems cannot be sustained. There you go. That's really pretty much the level of most of what goes on in the universities, which I'm always a little loath to say because I know that these are, and I work in one that is publicly funded. So there's this kind of, I want to tell the truth, but if you tell the truth too much, where's all that tax money going to go? So, you know, but that's really about all we manage. All right. So we live in a, I'm getting off the track here.
You are. Get back on track.
Profoundly unjust world and a fundamentally unsustainable world. That's a product of systems that are hierarchical. That is a product of hierarchy. All of the evils and ills that come with that, whether it's sexism, racism, homophobia, the economic inequality, or the ecological unsustainability, all come from systems that are defined by hierarchy, that are dependent on the notion that someone is and must always be over another, and that is the kind of masculinity we live with. And I think that has to change. Now, I don't want to end on such a downer note. You know, we people from North Dakota, we're not the most chipper. How many famous comedians came from North Dakota? I make my point. Not counting Lawrence Welk. He's actually the most famous North Dakota. There was always something kind of funny about Lawrence. So I'm going to end in a kind of I'm going to make a counterintuitive move to end. I'm going to go for the uplifting, upbeat, hopeful ending from Andrea Dworkin. And if anybody knows Andrea's work, Andrea wasn't afraid to kind of tell it like it was, including in very harsh ways, and she was known as someone not particularly prone to being upbeat. But this is another passage from that same speech in 1983 to the men's group. I want a 24-hour truce during which there is no rape. It's in a wonderful collection of her work, by the way, called Letters from a War Zone, published in the mid to late 80s. I really want to, just as a digression, Andrea Dworkin really did have an incredibly profound effect on my life and the lives of a lot of other people. And for reasons that I could discuss, but won't go into, Andrea has really fallen off the canon of women's studies. You can go into women's studies departments where there are students who will not only never read any of Andrea's work, but never hear her name. And I think that's a shame, because I think Andrea was one of the really important writers, not just one of the important feminist writers, but one of the important writers of the last half of the 20th century. And the book I recommend most often is called Letters from a War Zone. I'm not even sure it's still in print, but it's in libraries. It's, I think, where her thinking is most accessible, most powerful, and this particular speech is one that was probably the most powerful for me. And so I kind of want to give Andrea the last word. In saying that, I don't want to suggest I agree with everything Andrea ever wrote, or that everything Andrea wrote in 1983 was applicable today, but the core of her message, this relentless naming of hierarchy and the toxic effects of it, and the unwillingness to look away, is what I think defined Andrea. And in that same speech, she said to men, "We do not want to do the work of helping you to believe in your own humanity. We cannot do it anymore. We have always tried. We have been repaid with systematic exploitation and systematic abuse. You're going to have to do this yourselves from now on, and you know it." And I think that's an appropriate place to end this first night, because I think, as Chuck and Frank and others have already said, that is really the challenge for us to take up the gift that feminism has offered us and decide whether or not we're going to make good on it. Thank you. I'll look back to Chuck and Frank. How do you want to handle the rest of this time?
We've got some time for some questions. If folks have some questions.
Sure. Yeah. You know, usually at this point, there's some, Chuck didn't do it, but people say, you know, make sure you ask a question to the speaker and keep it short. I would like to arbitrarily modify that and say, you don't have to ask a question and go on as long as you want. But this really is a space not to pretend the person at the podium has the answers. But there's so much experience and so much knowledge in this room, I would hope you would take off on that. Yeah.
So the 10 or 11-year-old boy comes to you and he asks you, what is it to be a man? And your response now?
Well, I have a son, so I've actually had some of these conversations, although I'm divorced from his mother and I was never the primary or custodial parent. In a way, I think if we do our work right, the question would never come up. Right? That is, if we model a kind of life that embodies these concepts, and kids pick it up normally. I think everybody who's a parent knows that the most effective parenting isn't done by lecturing, it's done by living. And so that would be my ideal. And one of the things I did with my own kid was I dragged him to a lot of, even when people thought he was much too young to go to such things, I dragged him along to a lot of political events, right, where it wasn't because I wanted him to listen to the speaker, I wanted him to be around people talking about these things. So a lot of anti-war work, a lot of, feminist kinds of work. I didn't, bring him to my pornography lectures when he was 6 years old or anything, but a lot of it, I think, was about that. Now, if he did actually come to me and say that, I think I would, in a way that was, I would hope I could manage in a way that was age appropriate, to ask him, well, what does it mean to even need to be a man in the first place? And where does that come from? And I suspect that could kick off a discussion about, well, here's what's going on with my friends. Here's what the boys at school are saying. Here's what happens when I'm on the football field and I cry or what, And then I think rather than trying to articulate a list of things, it's about what we model and then the conversation that comes out of that. And, like most difficult questions with kids or students, or you try and divert them so that they forget that they asked you a hard question and don't ask you to answer it in the first, because you don't really have an answer in that sense. But obviously, when kids are really small, trying to deconstruct the concepts of masculinity and femininity gets a little difficult. So you try and do it in ways that make sense. But the truth is, kids are dealing with it from a very early age. They know it long before we think they're thinking about what it means. Gender, masculinity, femininity, they're dealing with it. And of course, in this culture, they deal with it much earlier than dealing with it much earlier than when I was a kid. I look back and think life was hard in the 1960s and 70s in Fargo, North Dakota, coming to terms with this, but it's nothing like what it is today. The pressure is more intense, it's more relentless, it's more sexualized, and it starts much earlier. So we're forced to have these conversations much earlier. Yeah. I saw your hand, sir, in the white.
I don't really have a question so much. I've been working in mentoring for a few years, and recently I've had an opportunity to work in culture with mentoring, and I sort of reverse that. I don't wait for them to ask me what it means to be a man, ask them. And without exception in my culture anyway, what they always say is to be a warrior.
Yeah.
I say, well, what does that look like?
Yeah.
And they give me the second list every time.
Really?
Every time. And so what I tell them is that the list is upside down and backwards, because what a warrior is the first list, and always has been.
Yeah.
What has happened is mainstream media, television, movies, street corner thugs, wherever it's all over. That modeling has been wrong. And so, I can't tell them to do it different, because they're not listening. All I can do is try and show them to do it different. In our culture at one time, a lot of what you're talking about was the way it was.
Yeah.
Respect women, honor women. They're life givers. I tell young men, I'm one of those people that they were talking about earlier. If I see people acting like that in public, what I like to do is ask the question, would it be sister,
Mhm.
or your mother, or your grandmother, or your daughter. You know? If not, then consider treating her like she was.
So what you're saying is, in traditional culture, which I assume is indigenous, I don't know what tribe or group you're talking, what nation you're talking about, and obviously different indigenous nations are different, but there is a kind of common, you have an older culture to go back to
Yes.
that you can invoke and say, listen, you've been sold a bill of goods by the white-dominated entertainment media, which has constructed Native men as this sort of caricature of violence. And if you actually, as many of you in the room know, if you actually look at the history of most of these nations and tribes, they were not necessarily male-dominated. Some had male chiefs with councils of women that, you know, and it's a very complex story, which of course in American pop culture gets rendered as, you know, hyper-violent men and completely passive domesticated women, right? Which is the typical perversion of both a white supremacist culture and then a pop culture that reduces it. And so you're talking about going back to more realistic, you know, roots of the tradition. Those of us who are European, we don't have that. I mean, that's part of the, you know, European culture has always been, you know, defined this way. So in a strange way, you have a kind of advantage there, which, you know, we can think of other ways to work with if we're not from indigenous cultures too.